like so many others, I have my own story about how I went TPRS. Once upon a time, I, as a Spanish teacher, presented my lessons according to the more traditional skills-based approach, or what I now like to refer to as skills and drills. Lessons focused around the study and practice of a point of grammar, thematic vocabulary, and verb conjugation. Some of it was because, as a student, I could have been considered a 4%er. That's those of us in the top 4% of all who study a second language, who are so fascinated and into it that we will get it no matter how it's presented. And fascinated with it, I was. Even back in high school and college, at times, even the very second I would think of a word, I just had to get out my University of Chicago Castillo and Bond paperback dictionary. Anybody remember those? In order to find out how to say that word in Spanish. No matter how it was served up, I could eat it all as if it were peaches and cream. Almost no effective filter. For me personally, almost all input was comprehensible. It made so much sense to me. It was all a cinch. And I just couldn't understand how anyone else studying it could have so much trouble. When I went on to teach it, this was part of the reason why I did it more according to skills and drills. It had been good enough for me, but it was also because of how I was trained to teach earlier on. That particular instruction seemed quite heavy on theory behind acquisition and teaching methods, but practically speaking, quite a bit lighter in terms of what specific steps to take where the rubber actually meets the road. In terms of how it was presented, I also found it quite dry. I really had a hard time making a more pragmatic sense of it, especially in terms of how it would be applicable in my classroom. For me, it was a bit more than just a bit of a stretch. I suppose that the thinking was that if they educate us in the theories, we would automatically be able to figure out everything in terms of exactly how it all fit in our own classrooms by the time we got there. So I ended up doing as a lot of second language teachers, simply falling back on the old standby of using methods our teachers used in teaching us, but without really understanding the ideas behind why. And in spite of the occasional groans and grumbles of many of my students, for a while, I really did believe that this was the way it was done. Simply doing the best I could with what I knew, but feeling all the while as if I was only casting lots, letting the chips fall wherever they may, and simply accepting that some of your learners will get it and some won't. That's just the way it is. However, after enough problems on the part of my learners, I realized that I was not satisfied. I seriously started asking myself if the skills and drills approach really was the only way. I think it was the Lord speaking to my heart. So I started researching and reading about other approaches. With yet a little bit of apprehension, I was especially intrigued by TPRS and how practically everybody seemed to have something good to say about it. After 3 days of Russian, courtesy of Katya Pakova at the 2008 NTPRS conference in Minneapolis, I realized that within the scope of what Katya had presented, I had actually acquired. Lady Gaga хочет борщ. Lady Gaga kupit борщ. Lady Gaga борщ ест. Lady Gaga рад. Then from that fall on, back here in Oregon, as I applied what I learned at the conference in my own classroom, I noticed a remarkable and dramatically significant difference from requests for yet another explanation for the umpteenth time of when we use said and when we use a star. We went to class members coming to class all excited because they'd been in line at Walmart behind some Spanish speakers and had actually recognized from class things that they'd said. And that was how I was convinced that comprehensible input and TPRS really are among the ways I believe you have to do it if your students are to acquire any language to speak of, that is. But now I really wouldn't have it any other way. When it comes to a difference in perspective, there are no limits on what just a difference in time can make. In several of my other posts, we have focused on scriptural insights into camaraderie and harmony in being united around a common professional cause, particularly as world language teachers. In Ecclesiastes, we looked at the benefits toward the end of more fruitful labor, toward how it better keeps us going so we don't grow cold but follow through to completion. And so when an obstacle arises. But what can challenge this dynamic? And when it happens, what wisdom is applicable in how to manage it? In Acts 15, we looked at Paul and Barnabas' disagreement over allowing John Mark to participate in the second missionary journey. Paul lacked confidence in John Mark for having bailed on them in Perga in order to return to Jerusalem. Barnabas disagreed with him. As far as he was concerned, John Mark deserved another chance. It was so sharp a contention that Paul and Barnabas were unable to reach a consensus. They parted company. We also considered how this is just one example of how we are all prone to disagreement for all kinds of reasons. How sometimes we may be limited in what we can do, and how sometimes we can only accept the disagreement and move on. Finally, we've looked at how, even so, there is an appropriate and gracious way to still accept the other party concerned, even in spite of the disagreement, a way that is still after the Father's heart. I would now like to consider a couple of passages from epistles which Paul wrote a number of years subsequent to the time of the second missionary journey. My fellow prisoner, Aristarchus, sends you greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you greetings, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. What's different from before in terms of Paul's attitude toward John Mark? To the church in Colossae, Paul tells them Mark says hello and asks that they welcome him among them if he comes to visit. To Philemon, Paul names John Mark as one of his fellow workers who sends greetings. Then as he writes to Timothy from prison in Rome, he requests the company of John Mark because he is helpful to him in ministry. Does any of this sound like Paul still harbors reservations against John Mark as a teammate? Could God in time have actually revealed the benefits of any doubts about John Mark, which Paul may have had earlier on? Yes, Paul's take on John Mark, according to our passage in Acts, was not final. We see here over time that any concerns Paul might have had over Mark's true faithfulness were apparently more than satisfactorily addressed. Also worth noting, as he wrote this second epistle to his disciple Timothy, Paul was in prison in Rome. From the latter chapters of the book of Acts and other sources, we know that Paul by then, for better or worse, had been through quite a bit, and he knew that he didn't have a whole lot longer. Most of those who had labored with him had all left, including Demas, who had deserted him, turning his back on the faith entirely. But after all this was said and done, Paul was actually preferring to have John Mark as one who was actually helpful to him in ministry. And I think this, along with how I adopted TPRS, illustrates another important principle when it comes to a person's attitude over time, especially if you and that other person do not see eye to eye on something. When it comes to a difference in perspective, there are no limits on what just a difference in time can make. Over time, a person's perspective can change as they grow through what they hear and what they experience. Colleagues and others who hold a measure of influence in the educational establishment may be adamant and absolute over certain theories and ways and means. Yet these same parties, after some time and opportunity to see what really works and with whom, how, when, and why, may revise their perspective and throw out completely where they stood before, even more willingly incorporating the perspectives of those with whom they disagreed earlier on. Even when we know from experience what is really tried and true, sometimes a bit more sound agreement with your neighbor comes only after the latter has had a chance to get there by living through it, rather than merely having limited bits and pieces drilled in according to mere hearsay from someone else. In acquiring the wisdom which is required of us all as teachers, I say the best way to get there comes only through walking through one's own challenges, getting their own feet wet in their own moccasins. So in dealing with a person who disagrees with you, have patience. Remember, when it comes to a difference in perspective, there are no limits on what just a difference in time can make. Furthermore, if you have heard the words of Jesus and believed in he who sent him, set your hearts on the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all of these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you were called to peace. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as in Christ God forgave you. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals upon his head. Besides feeding them when they are hungry, and when they are thirsty, giving them something to drink, it is perhaps even more important just to give them time. How much time? There's really no way to know. It truly varies depending on the people involved and the specifics of the matter at hand. And remember, there will always be those whose perspectives will never change, who will always be determined in their way of doing things according to their way of doing things, no matter what. But in any case of this kind, the appropriate thing to do is always to just let it go and go about your business. Ultimately, their classroom is their classroom, and your classroom is yours. Give it over to the Lord and leave it in his hands. Cast all of your cares on him because he cares for you. Sometimes it can really be amazing, the circumstances under which a person may later decide to do an about-face from a standpoint on which they were more fiercely uncompromising earlier on. Whether it's skills and drills or comprehensible input, whether John Mark does or does not get to go, whether it's philosophical differences between you and a colleague, when it comes to a difference in perspective, there are no limits on what just a difference in time